Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name's Anthony Smith, and I'm the Chief Executive of the Westminster Foundation for Democracy. WFD is the UK's democracy support organisation founded 30 years ago. I'd like to welcome you to this conference on environmental democracy. Let me start by thanking our hosts and sponsors for this conference, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, as well as our two international partners, the National Democratic Institute and the World Resources Institute. We first thought of this conference last year and have been planning it for several months. Then Russia invaded Ukraine. Like many organizations represented today, WFD has Ukrainian staff and have been working to ensure their safety from day one. But like the rest of the world, we've also been considering the full implications of that shocking violation of international law. And the implications are so wide-ranging that the world will only be able to focus on the biggest, most critical issues going forward. Well, this conference is about those big and critical issues, perhaps the biggest and the most critical we face, namely slowing and then reversing damaging climate change and biological destruction, and slowing and reversing the growth in autocratic government. We've known for a long time about both these damaging trends, but we've not considered them as fully as we should, the link between them. And that's what we're going to do in these discussions over the next 3 days. If anyone needed an illustration, a violent and tragic illustration of why democracy matters, then the invasion of Ukraine provides it. Democracy is at the heart of that conflict. On the one hand, the lack of it in Russia that enables their leaders to pursue such destructive actions unchecked. And on the other hand, the commitment to embed it in Ukraine that has inspired such a united and determined defense of their country in a way that wouldn't even have been imaginable 10 years ago. I hope this conference will deepen our understanding of the links between those political factors and our natural environment. WFD's mission is to support political reform that deepens democracy. But as an institution and as individuals, we see the absolute urgency of action on the environment and believe that the challenge is essentially a political one. The science is clear, the political pathway is not, and that's where environmental democracy comes in. Environmental democracy isn't a new concept. The synergies between environmentalism and the key pillars of democracy are present in many international declarations and agreements, including the 1992 Rio Declaration, which deals with access to environmental information, public participation in decision-making, and access to justice on environmental matters. And those issues are also covered in the 1998 Aarhus Convention for Europe and Central Asia and the 2018 Escazú Agreement for Latin America and the Caribbean. And they come up in the UN Environment Programme's Bali Guidelines of 2010. But we need to go further and turn commitments, of which there are many, into action, of which there isn't enough. And the outcomes promised in Copenhagen, Paris, and Glasgow, as well as those from Cancun, Sharm el-Sheikh, and Kunming, depend on this. Collectively, we haven't done enough to bring out the links between democratic governance and sustainable, truly sustainable development. That's what we're here to talk about. I look forward to the discussions and remarks by democracy experts, by environment experts, and by politicians who, of course, need to be experts in both. The format for this conference is a hybrid one. The sessions today and tomorrow will be online, and you'll have received links to the sessions that you've already signed up to. The latest program is online on the WFD website, and we might be able to put a link to it in the chat as well. The third day, day 3, will have an in-person element, but with many speakers joining remotely. And we also have several pre-recorded speeches from ministers. I've actually seen all of them, and they're excellent, not too long, they're engaging, and they're absolutely focused on the issues that we need to address. So in this first session, I now have the honor and pleasure of introducing the keynote speaker for today and the respondent to that speech. Our keynote speaker is Nick Mabey. Nick is an engineer by training. He did his master's in technology and policy from MIT, and that, I think, gave a pretty good indication of the direction his career would take. He worked in the electricity industry before moving to WWF and then into government. And in government in the UK, he worked in the Foreign Office, where he established its climate diplomacy network, as well as in Downing Street as a senior advisor in the Prime Minister's strategy unit. Nick then co-founded E3G and has been chief executive since 2006. And for those who don't know them, E3G is an independent climate change think tank, which, as their website says, Nick, tries to turn arguments into answers, and we definitely need answers. And we're very grateful that Nick agreed to join us today, not least because he's on sabbatical until the summer. And after Nick has spoken, there'll be a response from another Nick, Nick Bridge. Nick has been the UK Foreign Secretary's Special Representative for Climate Change since May 2017. Nick trained as an economist, and having started in the Treasury, he was appointed Chief Economist at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office before becoming UK Permanent Representative to the OECD from 2011 to 2016. And he served in diplomatic postings to China, Japan, and the US. And after that, we'll move into the panel discussion. But right now, Nick, maybe, please, we're really looking forward to your opening speech. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Anthony, and thanks very much for inviting me to give this some remarks on this issue, which has been really kind of close to my heart through unfortunately over 30 years of work on environmental protection. So as you mentioned, I started my career on environmental democracy in WWF in the 1990s, and I was working looking at community control of resources like forests or parks, mangroves all over the world. And wherever we worked, it was clear that both livelihoods and ecosystems were being systematically undermined by poor governance, local corruption, and global economic forces, all of which overwhelmed local communities' ability to organize their own life and run traditional management systems. On that, I moved into the Foreign Office, which was setting up a new environment policy department. And there I worked directly on implementing the Aarhus Convention. I established a Foreign Office fund on environmental, worked extensively with Marta and others in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine, actually. And we created, again, with one of your other sponsors, WRI, a regrettably short-lived international partnership for Principle 10 at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. But I discovered actually the UK government had a rather mixed approach to environmental democracy then. It was doing real path-breaking work on illegal timber, banning trade, but also helping bottom-up community rights in exporting countries. But also one of my biggest arguments in government was with the Foreign Office Human Rights Department, who were strongly against promoting environmental rights at the UN, which has just been agreed last year, seeing it as a dilution of the focus on political rights. So they're seeing environmental democracy being anti-broader democracy. In other jobs in the UK government, including in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, I worked on environmental crime, corruption, organised crime, both of which were central to my work on UK fisheries management, which was a great example of where environmental management fails to be rooted in rule of law or consent of those who are managed, causing really deep problems which we're still struggling to deal with. And finally, my remarks are based on my work at E3G for the last 15 years, where we've been working to deeply analyze the climate politics, what makes countries make decisions on climate in over 35 countries globally, but also working to build coalitions to move change in areas like energy systems, infrastructure, finance, adaptation. And in all of these areas, and all of my experience, the critical issue to solve has not been the technicalities of climate policies, though these of course matter, but the accountability of governments to their population, the transparency of decision-making, and the ability of individuals and communities to have effective access to justice and preservation of their rights. Without these elements of environmental democracy, which are summed up so succinctly in Principle 10 of the Rio Convention, unfortunately not known as well as it should be, any climate policies will be incapable of surviving the kind of opposition and turbulence which is inevitable in the transition to net zero climate resilient societies. And that's the core point I want to make today, is we need to put democratic values, institutional strengthening and governance innovation back at the heart of climate action if we're really serious about protecting everyone from catastrophic climate change. We also need to constantly remind people that we need to get serious about climate action if we want to protect our fragile democratic system and human rights. A world of extreme climate change would undermine national and international legal systems as shocks and shortages turn people and societies inwards and elevate the politics of fear and power over rules and cooperation. Tackling climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a democratic civilization issue. And we need to spell out these threats, not in order to scare people, but in order to motivate the kind of cross-society coalitions of actions we need to limit climate change to safe enough levels and build resilience of those unavoidable impacts. It really isn't enough to follow the science. Anyone seriously concerned with climate change must also work to rewrite the way societies make critical collective decisions. And that work has to go far beyond the narrow climate, energy, transport, and environmental policies to tackle fundamental issues of rights, control, devolution, compensation, and accountability. And reflecting on this speech, my real concern is these vital issues are currently not high in the priorities of climate actors, whether they're governments or businesses or activists, as they need to be. Despite the recent rise in climate mobilization, there's still a tendency to focus on technocratic responses and stakeholderism, ignoring more fundamental issues of accountability and representation. Indeed, while the very important Glasgow Pact calls for engagement with youth and Indigenous peoples, it fails to even mention elected legislators, the constitutional backbone of democracies. When issues of democracy and accountability are raised, they mainly seem to focus on stopping the influence of fossil fuel companies on government policy. This is important, but its impact is slightly blunted by the fact that governments themselves actually own over 80% of global fossil reserves. Governments are the largest fossil companies in most parts of the world, and it's their accountability that is necessary. So I want to really, in my remarks, cover 4 critical points. Firstly, environmental democracy is in retreat across the world, driven by the broad rise in authoritarianism, but also specific environment factors. This requires urgent work to support and defend these rights and the environmental defenders who are often at risk. Secondly, that strengthening environmental democracy is mission critical for solving climate change. More accountability, transparency, and access to justice will be needed to shape the deep reforms needed for rapid decarbonisation and preserve political support for climate transformations. But on the other hand, climate change is also an opportunity to build alliances with broader groups focused on accountability, anti-corruption, good governance. The global changes driven by climate action open the door to powerful new alliances for democratic change, which we must put central to our action. To build a reliable basis for climate action, there's a need to properly integrate environmental democracy approaches across climate policy, governance, financing, and have much franker discussions about the system conditions needed for change. People talk a lot about the seriousness of the climate emergency. Well, that is backed up by a governance emergency we need to tackle. And that's because environmental democracy is in retreat globally. The retreat of democracy and closure of civil society space is well documented over the last 15 years. What's usually less well known is that environmental defenders have now become the largest group of rights activists being attacked and losing their lives, if you look at the Global Witness survey. Partly this is due to a normalization of repression as autocratic societies have risen, but it's also driven specifically by tensions over the use of increasingly scarce productive land for industrial agriculture, access to minerals, and delivery of development projects. Tensions all arise from the same economic and demographic forces that have driven the acceleration of climate change. There has been a rise in disinformation, legal attacks, and information operations by both countries and companies against climate activists. Anti-coal campaigners in particular have faced government surveillance in countries from Poland to India. As decarbonisation deepens and incumbents face significant write-downs in the value of their assets. So it's critical that protections are increased before these stresses hit, keeping space for civil society and citizens' action open. This also means prioritising environmental democracy inside diplomatic relations, both climate and human rights driven, and within political party families, in city-to-city relationships, and broad governmental, non-governmental diplomacy networks. We need a whole-of-society approach to this engagement. International norms need to be reaffirmed and supported much more explicitly, not least because the proportion of greenhouse gases from countries with closed civil society space and low levels of democratic governance will rise by 2030 to cover over 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Democracies are cutting emissions, autocracies are growing emissions. That's where the issues lie for all of our safety in the future. And that just starts to show why environmental democracy is so critical for delivering our climate security. It isn't just the right thing to do, it's mission critical for the climate transitions we need. And just to remind you, keeping climate change to 1.5 degrees requires fundamental transformation of all global energy, industrial, transport, infrastructure, and agricultural systems in the next 3 decades. Now, climate analysis often talks about the material and financial conditions for this, how many trillions of dollars, how many gigawatts of solar panels, but rarely about the changes needed to governance, regulatory, administrative, legal, and business systems. And that's a critical mistake, because many of the current systems that decide on infrastructure, energy, and urban planning are controlled by small groups of entrenched incumbents, often with tacit or openly corrupt relationships. And without reforms to deliver responsive, adaptive, innovative, and public interest-focused governance, it'll be impossible to achieve the change at the pace needed. Put simply, if we can't make good decisions about the present, how will we be able to make good decisions about the future? So delivering on the net zero promises made in Glasgow needs to start by asking if national and subnational governance systems are fit for purpose, and if not, then what reforms are needed. And this change needs to happen immediately. It can't be put off. Governance reform require patient and relentless work. It took over a decade to reform the European Union's gas network planning system, which was completely controlled by incumbent operators, just to make its future gas demand forecasts and financing consistent with the EU's legal targets. It also took years of freedom of information requests and forensic analysis to uncover that the energy models being used by the European Commission were systematically undervaluing the potential of household energy efficiency, making higher targets look more expensive and less achievable. And even the Commission hadn't understood those assumptions until it was made publicly transparent. And I use these examples not because the EU is badly governed compared to other systems, it isn't, but because even in a sophisticated and open system like the EU, there are deeply entrenched interests and assumptions that need reform to meet the hugely ambitious pace of change we need. With no disrespect to my friends in the UK Climate Change Committee Secretariat, the most important aspect of their work is not their often brilliant analysis, but the fact they report to Parliament and the burden of proof is on the executive to justify change in their recommendations. This has represented a quasi-constitutional change to the UK governance system, creating a new space for public debate with full transparency for legislators and the public. The fact that similar institutions have been created in over 40 countries show there is beginning to be an understanding of the need for permanent governance reform to drive the climate transition. Important as climate assemblies have been in some jurisdictions, especially to set targets, permanent bodies are needed to support the long arc of change over the coming decades. And again, it's not that countries with poor democratic systems or low levels of transparency can't make some good technical decisions. In some way, that's the easy part. It's that all governments make mistakes or have to respond to unexpected changes while become beholden to incumbent interests, ideas, and assumptions. Climate change is full of known unknowns, as Don Rumsfeld put it. We know we will be surprised by technologies, delivery failure, public attitudes and resistance, and the complex, interlinked, and emerging impacts of a changing climate. Climate change cannot afford to solve these problems by slowly muddling through or waiting for incumbents to retire or be outcompeted. Winning slow on climate is losing. Only open, accountable, and transparent governance can help institutions, both public and private, adjust to a pace of change far faster than they naturally want to move. And the bottom line is countries with responsive and flexible governance will be best placed to win the net zero competitiveness race and build effective resilience to unavoidable climate impacts. So environmental democracy is vital to delivering the quality of governance needed to reach net zero in time. Even basically authoritarian governments or those deeply entangled with fossil fuel interests will face pressures to adjust and adapt to this reality over time. But improving environmental democracy is also vital to maintain political support for deep decarbonisation over the coming decades. Whatever you may hear in the media, achieving net zero is remarkably cheap for most countries who are not large oil and gas producers. The cost has fallen to well under 1% of GDP compared to over 40 to 60% of GDP being spent in the public purse in most advanced economies, compared to funding pensions and healthcare Climate change is relatively cheap and great value for money. But that doesn't tell the whole story. Beneath these small additional costs are huge transitions which will create winners and losers across societies. Coal miners cannot easily switch to becoming and building wind turbines. Electric cars are so reliable that 2/3 of car mechanics will lose their jobs. As we shift consumption patterns, people will be asked to change who have very different ability and capability. Climate impacts and floods, storms, heat waves will increase, and access to affordable insurance will shrink even further. At a societal level, these transitions could be theoretically managed fairly, but the question, will they be? Who will win and who will lose? Who is protected and who will pay? Who is deciding and who is consulted? Every country will need to define a new social contract that is seen fair in principle and practice by their population. Without such clarity, and especially if groups feel their interests are ignored, climate action will face public backlashes, often encouraged by politically hostile or partisan forces. For example, some analysts suggest around 70% of the Gilets Jaunes social media reach was generated by Russian state information operations. Here in the UK, failure to build support for UK onshore wind farms, backed by fossil industry lobbying, halted construction of the UK's cheapest form of clean energy for over a decade, a decision only now being revisited due to the Ukraine crisis. And it goes on, the biggest barrier for the next stage of European decarbonisation is public consent to grid rollout, smart technology and use of personal data, radical changes in homes and consumption. Sustainable support for these big changes requires trust in government and open consultation. It's not an issue of whether people support climate policy in the abstract, but this imperative being overridden by other more direct concerns about economic impacts and unfairness. And similar considerations happen when we're looking at supporting interests in transition. Studies across Europe show that bad outcomes happen when governments intervene late with specific firms, but good outcomes on just transition come when you involve whole communities and regions early in the transition. Better environmental democracy is the how of just transition, which we need to move forward. And finally, the issue of procedural and legal fairness is particularly stark when dealing with adaptation and recovery from climate impacts. Governance systems for climate resilience are weak, including in advanced and middle income countries, as the cruelly disasters we saw in China, Japan, the US, Canada, and Germany in 2021 shown. Meanwhile, other countries like Bangladesh have invested in good governance and responsiveness and massively improved their resilience in the last decade. Resilience is a result of good governance, not just wealth, which you would not understand if you attended the UNFCCC talks. And the governance failures on resilience stem from three core failures of environmental democracy. Firstly, a lack of clear rights for protection and compensation, including countries like the UK, US, and Germany, where no compensation comes unless there are huge disasters, as we saw with 40 billion euros for the German floods last year. But people impacted by slow onset or distributed disasters, or those with weak rights or low rights to the resources they have or access to courts, no compensation. There's a lack of transparency on climate risk data, not just for technical reasons, but because in some countries, for example, water use data is a national security aspect, and many cities are worried about putting out climate risk data in fear that real estate prices will fall. It's a big issue on the east coast of the US. And finally, there's a lack of consultation with climate impacted groups who tend to be scattered and diverse, not well organized. National hazards are often dealt with at different levels. There's no single agency. In the countries we've studied, all 35 of them, the consistent result is the voice of climate impacted groups systematically underrepresented in climate debates. And this legal asymmetry between the climate impacted and fossil fuel groups in defining national policy is perhaps one of the most critical barriers to effective, rapid climate action. So if stronger governance and accountability is critical for climate action, then the flip side is also true. The existential nature of climate change and the huge changes it's driving through economic, political, and social systems opens the door to major advances in democratic accountability and new big tent coalitions for change. In many countries, people understand big infrastructure decisions have corruption, but if it just results in 10% higher costs, it doesn't create a backlash. For that, you need a big impact. Failure to account for climate change and infrastructure potentially reaches the threshold for public attention, because poor decisions will lead to a generation of polluting, stranded, and vulnerable assets which will need to be replaced before the end of their working life. as we've seen in South Africa with the failure of the Eskom utility due to overinvestment in coal. And we're seeing these kind of joint public demonstrations come out in Costa Rica. It's a fascinating movement called Costa Rica Limpia, which is protesting against vested interests blocking electrification and improvement of public transport in favor of fossil fuels. But beyond animating public process, climate change also gives potential to leverage the huge power of financial actors to scrutinize the quality of decisions and how they align with climate goals and impacts. Most major investors are now committed to managing climate risk and reporting. BlackRock apparently has 100 people working on climate impacts analysis. They also have a requirement at directors level to take into account these risks, which is backed up by legal liability, which public interest lawyers and shareholders are moving forward. As climate risk becomes more prevalent in the financial sector, we'll see pressure on both public and private sectors to improve their governance and risk management and align themselves with the public interest and public targets. There's huge potential for synergies between climate and governance actors, but groups who currently have few connections. This will avoid climate change and the climate movement trying to reinvent the governance wheel, but also will build those kind of big coalitions we need for governance reforms. So that's the core framework. We need to do better environmental democracy to solve climate change, but also offers huge opportunities. I wouldn't want to give a huge policy speech. This is more opening remarks, but there are sets of issues we should look. We should incorporate the principles of environmental democracy into NDCs and processes. We should support more strongly establishing climate change committee oversight institutions around the world with explicit mandates for public engagement. We should encourage legislators to oversee infrastructure decisions more strongly and make sure they're consistent with climate goals and projections. A legal right to know your climate risk would underpin the impacted groups, and requirements to ensure explicit resource rights for vulnerable groups if you're going to deliver international adaptation support, and even intergenerational ombudsman and people coming up to help future generations have a voice at the equation. These are the types of actions that should be priorities for our climate cooperation to lay the basis for real change. We've now ended the first stage of climate action in setting targets and objectives for every country in the world. We're now getting into the difficult delivery stage, where opposition, competing priorities, and institutional inertia will need to be overcome against the backdrop of increased climate damage and broader geopolitical turbulence, which we can't avoid. A credible and politically resilient transition requires the buffers, checks, and balances provided by democratic and accountable systems. Stronger environmental democracy is not just an optional extra. It's the only way to deliver a safe climate for everyone. Thanks very much.
Nick, thank you very, very much for a fantastic start to this session. Nick Bridge, could I just ask you to respond to that, please?
Thanks so much, Anthony and Nick. And just for listeners, I'm delighted also that a very female-heavy 2 panels will follow us 3. The organisers have thought very carefully about that, and that will come. But I'm really honoured and delighted, Anthony, you and the team have put a huge amount into this. There was an important inquiry last year by the Foreign Affairs Committee into environmental democracy, and this has been a thread running through our work as Nick has described. I've got the more challenging role of deliberately not preparing remarks, because that would undermine the entire purpose of being a genuine respondent. So I will instead, having thought deeply about these issues for a long time, and as have many of my colleagues, just try to give a few thoughts around the framing of what Nick said and what your conference is set out to achieve, and then loop back round as I've been thinking rapidly as Nick's been talking about some of the specific points that he's raised. So thanks for this fantastic opportunity. I start by just reflecting on the 3 biggest moments in my 5 years in this role. One is specific to my government department, one is specific to the UK, and one is global. The first of those is the integrated review, which in the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office and the other offices with international responsibilities put tackling climate change and halting biodiversity loss as our #1 strategic international priority. And that reflected years of efforts to fully understand the scale of the risks we face and to just put it up there as number one. That was a very important moment last year when the government's international perspective was clearly set out. Number one priority. The second moment for the government of the UK was the net zero legislation, which took the first ever Climate Change Act of 2008, the first ever act globally of 2008, and enhanced it, took it further and said net zero emissions before the middle of the century. And Nick highlighted some of the really powerful elements of that, including the formation of the Independent Climate Change Committee, the carbon budgets, and this statutory binding of the UK into this irreversible trajectory. The net zero legislation fundamentally took this agenda out of the climate and environment bubble and made it about the mainstream direction of society and the economy. This shifted the burden of action into treasuries, into central banks, into transport ministries, into those making infrastructure decisions, and so on. So the profound importance of net zero for the UK was perhaps not fully recognised at the time, but it is absolutely now locked in through legislation, through the Parliament. And the original Climate Change Act was the biggest majority in the UK Parliament of the 20th century. It was looked at as a rather marginal issue by many, or a controversial issue, or a sort of an environmental lobby issue that was very hard to achieve. But when civil society put together a very impressive and unified campaign, and when business came in behind it, because they wanted clarity and they wanted stability around their future investment profiles, then we suddenly found we went from a marginal issue to absolutely the biggest majority of support in Parliament. So the process of getting to net zero has been a profoundly important democratic one. The third issue of my time in this role that I reflected on is obviously COP26 and the Glasgow Climate Pact, the global agreement. And just as I've described the importance of the domestic legislation in the UK, COP26 then globalizes that. We went from having no countries, almost no countries, certainly no industrial countries a couple of years ago, committed in legislation to net zero, to getting commitments from 90% of the world to net zero. Now, a huge caveat there to Nick's point at the end. It's a target. It's been signed up to. It's been committed to. Have we delivered upon it? Do we all have strategies and policy frameworks that are aligned with it? No, not yet. So that's the huge next big space to occupy. But getting at this point in time, in the context of COVID, in the context of the growing populism and the challenges we face, the disrupted, fragmented, multipolar world, we got pretty much every country in the world to intensively engage over a period of months to each make domestic and through that multilateral commitments and hold this conversation together. So in a sense, the environment and the climate was the way that we kept intensive discussions going between all countries, all parties to the UN Convention at a time when we were all not talking about lots of other things. It's very important to recognize that climate and the environment was the substance that brought the world together last year. And obviously we now face the implementation of everything we agreed, but it was this issue that brought people together. So there's no better illustration of the profound link between the environmental cause and the democratic cause. So both domestically and multilaterally, this has been a means by which we've kept these conversations going right across our countries and societies and across the world. The other thing that came out very strongly from the early part of Nick's speech was just how profoundly these goals and targets are delivered through the rule of law, environmental protections, the huge questions of monitoring, reporting, verification, transparency, and especially enforcement. These are conversations that were at the heart of the intensive COP26 negotiations right through the year, and have been at the heart of COP negotiations for many years. But we made some profound steps forward at the end of last year in agreeing the Paris rule book. The clue is in the title. This was at the absolute heart of the movement, the environmental movement, was that we needed to centralize, mainstream, and legalize these processes. And when you look at what hasn't worked environmentally, let's look at the forestry question. We set the target to end deforestation many, many years ago and have profoundly failed to deliver on it. We actually had no choice at Glasgow but to go again on that. And one of the biggest headlines and important points around COP26 was the 141 countries covering 90% of the world's forests that signed up to reaffirm and to really double down on the commitment to end deforestation and to restore forestry. And the reason that's partly failed today is the lack of enforcement and democratic accountability around that, and the resources that need to go into that. So the rule of law and enforcing and accounting and all of those things, I absolutely agree with Nick, have been at the heart of both the domestic and the multilateral efforts, and we're now into profoundly important delivery phase. Another aspect of COP, one could talk about COP all day, but I've only got a couple more minutes. But I'd just like to stress how much we try to mainstream the agenda. I've talked already about getting out of the kind of climate and environmental box and getting into mainstream economic, financial, political thinking. All of our work on climate, diplomacy and democracy, to quote paraphrase one of my predecessors in this role, is about expanding the political space and creating the political space to do what we need to do. And we really put, I acknowledge what Nick says about some of the, we can do more to embed some of the language. I think you mentioned the example of the youth. But if we think about the work plans for Indigenous peoples and local communities, the weight on the just transition, the weight on adaptation that was fundamentally not at the center of previous COPs. We've doubled our overall climate finance, but we've explicitly set out commitments to adaptation finance. We've put a huge effort into the Santiago network and other means to which to genuinely build up the loss and damage conversation. And we've done a lot more work around young people, and the pre-COP indeed was entirely heavily rather focused on giving the voice of youth an appropriate platform. There's always more one can do on these empowerment agendas, but I think that it was fully recognized that the only way we got that full agreement across the parties was through thinking about these things as fundamentally things that affect every level of government: community, regional, town, city, and prefecture, province, state, and not just national government. We really tried to make this whole of society, whole of economy approach. So my concluding reflections, maybe three thoughts, building on Nick's provocations. I think the first thing that comes out very clearly is, in a world where we're not entirely democratic, there has to be leadership and ambition. And democratic countries have an absolute responsibility to get their own house in order. That was something that worked well last year, where the UK tried its best to have the most ambitious possible target for our domestic action compatible with what the science said was needed, which has always driven the legislation and targets. The G7 then all made 1.5 degree compatible targets. So those big democracies especially have this responsibility to get their own house in order. And as Nick says, what flows from that is economic success, is clean air, is a reduction in the 8 million people dying prematurely from poor air quality around the world, is, actually a democracy, the UK, which took us from 40% coal to zero coal because of its regulatory environment and the incentives for business to get into the cleaner energy sector. So getting our house in order, firstly. Secondly, around what works. And I think being realistic as we think about environmental democracy, about what we actually need to achieve. This is this very powerful statistic Nick gave about the huge majority of emissions that will come from less democratic and very fossil fuel dependent places, and that if we don't have any influence over or engagement with, we will all suffer the consequences of this ultimate global market failure, a public good challenge. So while democracies have their responsibility, that responsibility is equally to ensure effective engagement with everybody who matters on this agenda, both the poorest and most vulnerable, but also those where most emissions will continue to come from. And there is this assessment out of many energy analysts as to the fact that while many democracies will move quickly out of dirty energy, many economies and many state-owned companies will have a very strong interest in being the last fossil fuel entity standing and will continue to happily benefit from fossil fuel profits for many, many years to come. So working out that engagement and that conversation in a very smart and sophisticated way is a huge, potentially the central core of our climate diplomatic strategy. And we do have the biggest diplomatic resource of any country in the world on this, and we retain that through our COP presidency this year. It's a hugely powerful way to engage with China on carbon markets or on clean green finance or on ending international financing of coal, on the Belt and Road, on our shared investments in third countries. It's a huge part of the current focus on Russia and Ukraine, how we shift off Russian oil and gas and accelerate the clean transition. It's a huge part of our support to many Middle Eastern economies that are becoming increasingly unlivable in their climatic conditions, and where we can support that diversification of their economic structures. So we've got to be realistic about where these emissions are coming from, where adaptation and resilience is being felt most urgently, and what our democratic response and engagement with that is. And again, I would point back to the COP, where we all came together, countries of all different governance structures, and ultimately did, in broad terms, what was demanded of us by the science and by environmental groups and by young people in terms of setting targets, not yet in terms of the delivery. And then my third and final reflection is this very challenging point that Nick raised about the transition and just how difficult that will be. The disruption, and we're seeing it play out every day at the moment in a tragic way in the Ukraine. The disruption we see more generally, though, not just from direct climate and environmental breakdown and lock-in and extreme weather and unlivable climates and drought and impact on food security and water security and energy security. All of those things play out in a very politically disrupted scenario. And this is an environment in which it's very easy for simplistic narratives around the cost of net zero or around the dangers of moving too quickly or the vested interests using these processes and using misinformation and different means to undermine what we need to do. And I think confronting that, full on and showing the power of the majority, the power of the young people's voices, the power of communities who actually can show what resilient and sustainable communities look like. We've got to support and draw out those voices if we're going to manage this very disrupted period that will be very difficult for us to use to accelerate rather than see a deceleration of what we need to do. Thank you, Anthony, very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Both Nicks, for those introductory remarks and those really thoughtful response. Fiona, I'm going to hand over straight to you. We've overrun a bit. We've got about an hour now. Fiona Harvey, environment correspondent for The Guardian, previously the FT, is going to chair this panel. And over to you, Fiona.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that introduction, Anthony. And thank you to Nick Mabey and Nick Bridge for a fantastic keynote and response there. That was just brilliant, I thought. Covered so much and imparted so much wisdom from both of you there, so thank you. Well, after that great start, we're going to move on to our panel where we'll talk about some of the practice of trying to deal with environmental issues through political means, because we've got some great practitioners for you today from politics. We've got some members of parliaments around the world and from the NGO space. So we've got 5 panelists. I'm going to take, first of all, I won't give an overview of introductions first. I'll introduce them one by one. They'll speak. I'm going to ask them to give us some examples of their own experience, to really kind of ground this in their own experience and tell us how to do this, this political solutions to environmental problems, how to manage that. So I'm going to go first of all to Tommy Garnett, who is the Chief Executive of the Environmental Foundation for Africa, which he founded in 1992. He's got extensive experience. He works with IUCN in Sierra Leone. He's worked as a UN expert and with BirdLife International and in various other roles in environmental protection in Africa. So Tommy, from your experience, how do we get these political solutions to environmental problems?
Thank you so much, and sincere apologies for the lateness. I got the timing wrong. So thank you for letting me join at this stage. Politics, environment, they don't seem to be bedfellows most of the time, at least in the current context where we operate. However, in the spirit of the aspiration towards democratic principles in environmental governance, which is really laudable, and it could be the best solution to provide, this could provide the best solutions to the challenges that we face. Sadly, we are living in a time, at least I speak from the West Central Africa perspective, where we have seen many challenges to governance or practice of democratic leadership over the last few decades. In the last 10, 15, 20 years, we have been recovering largely from the cycles of armed conflicts, natural resource related, which were in large part a result of if you like, the absence of environmental democracy in the way that natural resources are managed. And of course, what this has done is that it has exacerbated environmental degradation, land degradation, forest destruction, disappearance of species, exacerbation of poverty. And on top of that, we have a population that is expanding. About 30, 40 years ago, the 15 countries of West Africa, all of them had among them about less than 100 million people.
Hello, we seem to have lost Tommy there. I'm just
I'm
going
sorry. I'm sorry, the
Oh,
connection
he's
just
come.
broke. So I was saying, and now we have about 400 million people. In the next 30 years, we expect that number to shoot to over 800 million people. And that's just in West Africa alone, the second fastest growing in the world region. If you move towards Central Africa, the population is currently under 200 million. In the same time period, in 30 years, it's expected to be close to 400 million. And that's just two sub-regions. Now, when we look at this and you look at the history of the backdrop to the historical context of these countries and the challenges associated with governance, it is very little wonder that environment has suffered seriously. The West Africa region was once characterized as the Guinean forest of West Africa, which spanned 11 countries from Guinea right down to Sao Tome and Principe. It was one continuous forest belt. Today, only patches of that forest remain, and it's still under assault. So how can governments in these countries deal with democratic governance in an atmosphere where there is extreme poverty, there is low level of technology, very high levels of, appreciably low levels of literacy and technical capacity. There is a growing population. We also have to deal with the cyclical shocks. In 5-6 years ago, we had Ebola, which basically crashed many economies in 3 or 4 economies in the region and affected many others. Then you also have the autocratic tendencies of some of the leaderships, in addition to all of the internal struggles, the tribal competitions, the religious challenges, and so on and so forth. In a nutshell, it is very, very difficult to see how, given the present challenges that we are facing as a global community and as a West African community, it is really difficult to see how the environmental democracy indices can be fulfilled, even to a minimal average level, because of all of these pressing challenges. Of course, the last speaker just talked very briefly about the current situation in the world and how it has affected every one of us. Yesterday, there was a strike here because there was no fuel because of rising fuel costs, and most people are just out of pocket. So to conclude, I would simply say that at the end of the day, the future of environmental management in these parts of the world rests with the people who will be worst affected by the impacts of bad environment management and changing climate. There are ways and means in which communities, societies can be encouraged to lead efforts to stabilize the ecological basis on which all of our lives and livelihoods depend. Maybe I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tommy. That was great perspective from Africa there. And later in the session, we'll hear some more examples from you. So thank you for that. I'd also like to remind our audience that you can ask questions for our panelists through the Q&A mechanism. So please feel free to use that. I'm going to move on now to Maya Bataji, who's joining us today from Georgia. We're very privileged to have her with us today, especially given the extraordinary events that are going on at the moment. So please do give us your perspective on that as well, Maya. Maya is the chairperson for the Environmental Protection and Natural Resources Committee in the Georgian Parliament and has been working on the issue of environmental law for more than 25 years, including on things like the Aarhus Convention. So in an extraordinary political career at a dreadful time for the world, I wonder if, Maya, you could tell us what can be done to make more of the political solutions available for environmental protections. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. It's really my honor to participate in this very important event. Unfortunately, due to the technical problems, my camera can't be turned on, but I'm here with you, and it's really an honor to be with you today. Going back to your question and the question raised during this panel, I would like to emphasize that today's challenging environment, it is not easy to be a politician. It's not easy to be a politician and lead such an inspiring field as environmental protection and sustainable use of natural resources. However, it is a new and is directly interrelated to economical progress. This field is often referred to as an economic impediment due to this. It is clear what obstacles can encounter politicians working in this field. Situation gets more complicated to our country due to the amount of ambiguity and the turbulent geopolitical circumstances Georgia had. In addition, unfortunately, we are not energy independent, and in this term depend on the country that has occupied our territory, and Russia, who now launched unprovoked and unjustified attack against a sovereign and independent country, Ukraine. Nevertheless, I should admit that today I'm proud, however, that environmental protection legislation in Georgia today is completely different than the legislation we had, for example, 10 years ago. And it is principally due to the association agreement and the execution of multilateral environmental agreements the country is party to. It should be noted that Georgia has reached important progress in terms of effective environmental governance and elaboration of environmental legislation. In this transitional period, many relevant EU directives have already been harmonized to domestic law, and we plan to do much more in coming years. Due to this, our committee's priority, our parliamentary committee's priority for upcoming years is green economy, green growth, and circular economy, as well as promoting environmental issues in urban and rural areas. However, we believe that protection of environment is equivalent to protection of human rights, yet this only it is the only one way out to reach sustainable balance point between economy and ecology and protection of human rights. On the challenging path our country is going through, we are thankful for vital support we are receiving from our international partners and donor organizations, and among them Westminster Fund. I'm very glad that together with WFD, we are closely working on strengthening the fundamentals of environmental democracy. Despite we have adopted 2 fundamental laws that are vital for forming environmental democracy in the country, environmental impact assessment new code and the law on environmental responsibility, there are yet many work to be done and too many other laws to be adopted. As per my experience, I gained once being twice elected as a chair of the Bureau of the Meeting of the Parties to the Aarhus Convention. I exactly acknowledge the relevance of the protection of the right of each person of present and future generations to live in adequate environment for his or her well-being, as right to participate in the adoption of environmental decision and adequate right to environmental justice. Actually, our partnership with WFD is crucial as well in terms of adaptation to climate change and adoption of the new Climate Change Act, which we are going to develop together and which will be the key document for the implementation of the action plan contributed to the decarbonization of Georgia, as my country has very ambitious goals. I believe that adoption of a new Climate Act will become actually the turning point that will create synergies among all adopted laws and all the plans which were adopted and working plans and action plans toward decarbonization. And we hope that this law will create kind of the one big frame to create more synergies between institutional part in terms of enforcement as well. So I believe that our cooperation and generally future enforcement and harmonization with international standards will create very accurate and strong floor for future environmental democracy in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. That's a great perspective there. I'm sorry we couldn't see you, but we could hear you perfectly, Maya. So thank you very much. And you're staying to talk to us for a bit longer and also to participate in our Q&A, I hope. So thank you. And as I said, any questions for any of our panelists, pop them into the Q&A, please, as soon as you think of them. We're going to turn now to Marta Csigeti-Bonifart, who's joining us from Hungary, where she was the Executive Director of the Regional Environmental Centre for Central and Eastern Europe. She is currently the Vice President of the Institute of Directors in Hungary and serves in various other roles as well. But she's spent more than 35 years working around the environment in various capacities. So we welcome your experience, Marta, if you'd like to tell us how political solutions can be brought to bear. Thank you. We can't hear you. I think you're still muted. Thank you.
Now, it seems that, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now and see you. Yes, thank you very much, Marta. Yeah. Oh, hang on, we've lost your, you need to unmute again. We've lost your voice. Great, now we can hear and see you. Thank you very much.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much for the invitation. And as I was listening to the panel and also the keynote speeches, I really thought about my background. And it is quite interesting to look back a little bit, looking into what are we celebrating this year, the 50th anniversary of the Stockholm Conference on Environment. It was also the time when UNEP was founded. So these are all political processes and institutions. But it was also the time when Dennis Meadows and his colleagues have formulated a very interesting book, The Limits to Growth. And if you really recall what he said in The Limits to Growth, he said that by 2012, we would need more than one planet based on our consumption and the way how we live our life. Unfortunately, it came true. When in 2000, in the time when the Stockholm Conference was held, we had 3.5 billion people on the earth. Now we are almost 8. So looking back to what Tommy was saying, there is a huge increase. There is a huge increase in population, urbanization. Looking into 1987, when I started to work with environmental policy, it was a time when sustainability became an issue through the Brundtland's report. And that led later to the Rio conference. But please remember that Central and Eastern Europe at that time was one type of economy, one type of political system. So during this time, we have undergone a major change in our political system. We went to pluralism and market economy. And as one of my colleagues said, that immediately the market was driving everything and the profit. Immediately the development, unsustainable development, unfortunately, became very important. And unfortunately, solidarity went down the drain. So the issue is that we gained a lot and we have missed a lot of opportunities. So this is why this type of conferences, which recall the importance of participation, of access to information, to join to events and activities, and to enable people to make good decisions. The reason I'm saying good decisions, because through the Sustainable Development Goals, a whole global process was set up. And this global process could help stakeholders in the countries because they're used to the methodology. In our part of the world, one of the most important roles of the Regional Environmental Center was to enable young dynamic environmental leaders, provide traineeship, provide grants, and engage them into local and regional and global actions. Unless people do not take ownership on decisions that are affecting them, things will not change. And one of the best examples was that it came through that the changes also helped by the processes related to the environmental movement, the political processes, the Danube Circle at that time, the river basin managements at that time, and they enabled also to cooperate locally, with involving local citizens into action, and work regionally. Later, it continued at the Sava River Basin, the Drina, Drini River basins, and now it translated into resilience building these local communities and actors. The reason I'm pointing this out, because through these issues, it could be learned through the processes of how cooperation helps. And looking here to also the development agenda, I have to say that in the Drina River Basin, the countries were able to rebuild following the war. Through their cooperation, the ecotourism, clean up their communities and attract interested activists on the ground. So in essence, what I'm trying to say, yes, we do have a lot of available legislations, and the Aarhus principles really went through a lot of activities that we have been involved with. There is no thematic field that we didn't use the Aarhus process. The second area that I would like to point out is the importance of also providing education and training, because the sustainable solutions are there. What is missing, and here I'm highlighting it, is the attitude and the behavior. And for that one, this kind of activities that we are talking about today, I think is very essential, especially when we are facing all the crises that we have been talking about. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Marta. And yeah, that's a very important point, actually, that this behavior change is something that we haven't really grappled with anywhere in the world. And perhaps we will return to that as we come back to our panelists for the rest of the session. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on now to Abdel Rahman Sultan, who's joining us today from EcoPeace in the Middle East. He joined in 2000, I think, having previously worked for the Palestinian Institute for Arid Land and Environmental Studies. His special interest is the sustainable coexistence and prosperity in the Middle East. And he sees EcoPeace's model of environmental peace building as the best viable option. Now, perhaps, Abdel, you could give us a bit of a fuller explanation of what that environmental peace building actually means in practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And thanks for the previous speakers. I learned a lot from them as well. Working at EcoPeace and working in the Middle East, it's quite challenging because we live in an arid region and it's a marginal land where water resources are very scarce. Recently in Jordan, actually last summer, many of our dams went empty. and completely dry. And that was a scary moment for this region to see what could be the next steps. Are we going to witness more social instabilities or socio-economical unrest in this region because the natural resources are becoming more and more scarce? Since the establishment of our current regimes, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Syria, Lebanon, in the whole Levant area, we started to see confining borders, and people started to think within their political boundaries. We think Jordanian within Jordan, Palestinian within Palestine, Israelis within Israel, Lebanese and Syrians within their own countries. And that limited so much the flexibility to look at the regional and the larger scale. Today, ECOP is trying to look outside the box and say what can be done in terms of environmental advancement in order to solve environmental acute problems within this region. And here, when we think about democracy, this is not a democratic thing that people wanted to have in this Middle East, because the political conflict at the moment, Jordanian, Palestinians, or Arabs in general don't want to cooperate with the Israeli partners. And therefore, if we come to what is popular in this region, is fragmented solutions rather than coherent regional working together. So trying to work together, it's against the mainstream. Trying to educate people that working together is something for their own benefit. It requires lots of time and resources to go back to speak about the boundaries of the problems and how can we all working together on that. The political structure that we have in the Middle East does not have an equal level of democracy, if I may say. So some countries are much more democratic than others. And that shows that most of the information that is available on the highest top level is not available at the lowest level in the Middle East. So there is kind of disengagement, if I may say, between decision-making and the people. We have noticed lately that there was a signing of a letter of intent between Jordan and Israel with the United Arab Emirates to have the swap deal or the water energy nexus on between Jordan and Israel. And there was a major political opposition from the Arab side in Jordan that this is something that we don't want. Although this is something that is really important for providing water and renewable energy for the region to solve acute existential threats. So how this was communicated with the local societies and how we showed this as a government to the local people was missing to show that this is something that is really important from a technical point of view, from resource management, etc. But it wasn't communicated well. Therefore, in order to have a vibrant society, active society within the Middle East, heavy educational programs are needed. At EcoPeace Middle East, we work a lot on trying to educate different level of stakeholders that what is needed to be done on a national level, on a regional level. That's very difficult process, but it's effective in the meantime. So the environmental democracy in our region is not linear in a way. We have to do lots of education to show what it means to be active in order to understand the environmental concepts and the environmental consequences, and later on asking people to demand their rights to express their needs for a better future and better engagement. We suffer a lot here because of climate change. We're not a major climate change contributors ourselves. Therefore, when we speak about climate change, it takes a great deal of time to explain what it means to be calling for an adaptation measures to the climate change and why it's important to translate the mechanisms on a global scale to the regional level, to the national level, and how can we engage society to understand those concepts and trying to be calling for them. So here we have a serious issue of how to advertise or how to market what is activism in this region on environmental issues to make sure that this is something that will become more and more popular in the near future. In our point of view, that the Jordan River, which is a major river in our area, almost disappeared. We have 4% of it still remaining. We have witnessed that most of our groundwater is disappearing, and therefore framing a green-blue deal for the Middle East, where we look at supranational level, is important. We wanted to expand that actually to the Mesopotamian region and to the larger Levant area, and within the Mediterranean and MENA region, that we need to look in a coherent way, in a connecting way, that environment does not know borders, but also that's not only something that to say, but it's something that actually we practice here and when it comes to water, energy, climate, and other threats that we suffer from as well. Therefore, EcoPeace Middle East is working a lot on social engagement, a lot to bring what we call a bottom-up and top-down processes together in order to make sure that we understand the same language or speak the same language, trying to affect progressively the cause to move forward in the right direction. So we have a complex reality. I'm sorry about that. It's the conflict, it's climate change, and it's also the culture that we have here in our region that needs to be all addressed at the same time. I think that we have a long way to go. We needed to make sure that our region will continue to exist in the near future. That's why we try to engage with all different levels. So that's why EcoPeace is very open to all levels of activism in our region on an international level, in order to bring so much momentum to the process that we have at the moment. Probably I should stop here and open the floor for comments.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Abdul. And yes, I think we would agree that there is a long way to go on a lot of these issues. Thank you. I'm going to move now to our final panelist, Lisa Badam, who's joining us from the Bundestag today, where she is the Member of Parliament for the constituency of Bamberg and Upper Franconia, re-elected last year. She's chairwoman for her party at the Committee on Climate Protection and Energy, and also deputy member of the Economic Committee and the Committee on Foreign Affairs. So a lot of experience there in these issues, Lisa, and perhaps you could tell us how easy or difficult it is in your experience to bring political solutions to bear on our environmental problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. A lot of things has been said, so I don't know where to begin. And because I also want to answer to the remarks the other panelists made, but I would just start with one principle of my work as a parliamentarian, and I'm for sure I'm not the only one. I think it's very important to engage with civil society in tackling the climate crisis. So this, I think, is easier when you're in opposition, as we, the Green Party, were for the last 4 years, than it is then when you're in government. So for sure, there's a difference. For example, the last years, I was a lot of times as parliamentarian observer in the coal region in North Rhine-Westphalia, and I cannot say I supported this civil disobedience, but I mean, there were parliamentarians just there to observe and to report things. If the police, for example, would tackle the activists too hard or things like that, so just like to protest them. So a lot of parliamentarians were there and did that, especially from the Green Party and from the leftist party. Of course, those actions, they may be less when you're in government, because usually those protests are forming against the government. So it's more complex, but still we are thinking on how to engage in a permanent committee in the Green Parliamentary Group with civil society and with climate activists. So, but not just with climate activists, but also with youth activists for refugees' rights, Black Power activists. A lot of times those matters are connected with each other, and people are a lot of people are working on all the issues. So in general, we want to be connected with the movements, And it's we need these connections, not just for political, let's say, majorities or to solve problems, to have people behind us as political party, but also we need it in a practical sense. So that's what Nick said in the very first remark. Fossil fuels, usually they are held by private companies or by the state, but renewable energies, they can be held by private citizens. So what we had with the energy transition in Germany, are we still working on? We're not yet at the end, but the 50% of renewable energy we have, the majority is in the hand of private citizens. So without them investing in just installing solar panels, we could have not done it. And so obviously climate crisis has to be tackled by, let's say, I mean, the majority of society is important, but we will not have the majority of society on the streets and installing solar panels, but at least they should not oppose your legislation, because otherwise it's very difficult. So you need that, but also really activists and companies, social companies, which are really investing in renewable energy. So that's a clear link for us. Also, I wanted to answer to Abdel, if it's okay, because there was an aspect which I found very interesting. So Abdel, you talked about the difficulties. So it's a completely another topic, but just I didn't want to forget it. You talked about the difficulties between the states in the Middle East working together on the climate issue. And so German government just subscribed an energy partnership with Israel a few days ago. And I think we need a lot of those partnerships between states, and of course, not just Germany and Israel, but also Jordania should be, for example, part of this. As I heard, there are already projects where the desalting of water is be done together between the states. So I really think you do important work there, and I hope that we can contribute to that as German government. So just want to say that before I forget it, and maybe you can answer to that later on what you think what could be the role of German government in the region. So to get back to the link between politics, legislations, parliamentarians, and civil society, and to get to the end of my statement. Of course, civil society has a lot of expectations which we also cannot meet. So especially when you're a party in the government, you have restrictions. So in Germany, it's also restrictions of federalism. We have 16 federal states. Some topics are decided on another level. And also we have a coalition. So you have to deal with coalition partners, other parties. So you're always having kind of a compromise. And of course, climate activists cannot be satisfied a lot of times with this compromise, and they should not. So they are still fighting on it. And but you still need to communicate over those different opinions you have, and just try to have a fruitful conversation and to move forward together. And I think that's the challenge for us, the Greens especially, also for the whole government, but I think for us especially in government. As we see now, we face the war in Ukraine, and we face problems in our energy supply. And maybe you saw it, we have to travel to Qatar to buy gas there because we don't want to buy Russian gas anymore. So it's a very difficult situation for every person, also for our minister who wants to have climate action. So I think especially in this situation, it's really important to have politics and civil society together, and also to have a progress on renewable energies and energy efficiency, and not just talk about where else we can buy fossil fuels. So it's a really complex background at the moment. So it's even more important, as it was with Corona, that democracy and that democratic stretches are working and are functioning. So thank you so much for this panel and the topic.
Thank you very much indeed for that. That's really helpful, Lisa. And in fact, that last point that you raised is a really important one, because obviously, we've seen enormous changes, even just since COP26, which, as Nick Maybe and Nick Bridge were discussing, that only took place in November. And yet we've had the most enormous changes since then. The soaring price of energy, war in Ukraine, in many countries, the cost of living going up. People are worried about food supplies and food insecurity and so on. This whole situation has been made worse by the fact that we're recovering from a pandemic. In Germany, that conversation around energy and the environment has changed quite a lot, Lisa, hasn't it? Do you think that there will be a good outcome from this? Do you think that countries, Germany and others, will set themselves on a more urgent path to being green as a result of these crises at the moment? Or do you think there's a danger that we could go back to our old ways and rely more heavily on fossil fuels?
I think, Fiona, there's always a danger that we have backlash on fossil fuels, but I do hope that we will find the green path. And for example, just one signal I saw is the consultations on the European level about the Fit for 55 package and about the Green Deal. They changed substantially. So for example, Poland and Hungary, they are now, and also the Czech Republic, they demand higher targets for renewable energies now and efficiency, which before usually the Eastern European states were kind of blocking the path to climate neutrality. I mean, not totally blocking, but I mean, they were not really the pioneers of the movement. So, and it's because they see, as we all see, that with our dependency, we are weak. We are weak to our opponent, especially as it is someone like Putin. But I mean, he may not be the only one who's doing something bad in the future. So that's one sign I see. And also to come to an end, but just to have this one more example in our national legislation, we will give money to people because of the rising energy prices. But also in our package, we reduce the price of tickets for buses and for trains. So we had some climate legislation in this package, and also the efficiency standards for housing is more ambitious now than we have had it in our coalition treaty. So it's small steps, but I think we have to fight a lot for it. But I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And we're now in the Q&A part of this panel discussion. So if you do have questions for our panelists, please submit them through the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Anyone in the audience can submit a question, so please go ahead. There's a few questions there already, which I'm going to put to our panelists now. But any questions that you put up there, I will see. So please do feel free to put questions there now. So thank you, Lisa, for addressing this question of how the war in Ukraine and the economic impacts of that as well, that we're seeing on energy prices and on food prices around the world, how that is making an impact. I'd like to bring that question to our other panelists as well. Actually, I'd go to Abdel first, actually. Do you think that we could see a food price crisis again, and what impact could that have? And how could we head that off, and how could we use environmental, how can we ensure that we have an environmentally sustainable increase in food production where needed? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, in our region, we don't produce much to start with. So we are heavily dependent on food imports from outside the region. And at the moment, as the crisis started in Ukraine, we started to see an increase of 15 to 20% on most commodities here in this region. So it's really scary to see that with this increase, there is usually more, how you call it, dependency on the local environment. So there will be more degradation and more exploitation of the natural resources that we have in our region. I would like to mention that during Corona, there was a contradicting messages between in our region here that we need to produce more on a local level. Produce more, that means consume more water, and that will again have more impact on our water resources. So do we need to have a local solution only, or shall we look beyond the local solution or the regional solution to a larger solution where we can see where those food resources should come to our region? That's why it's really important that we don't move into the wrong direction of sustainability. I would like to say that yes, in the Middle East, we are going to see, I think, in the near term or short term, more increase in the food prices and more increase on the damages on the environment because of this. We need to empower people to think how can they become innovative, how they can become provide technical solutions on the ground. And there are many positive solutions after each conflict or after each episode of stress. We see that people become more and more innovative to provide innovative solutions in water, energy, and food production. The nexus between the three should be something that is dominant. I would like to mention that in our region, we utilize about 80% of our wastewater. We retreat it and we use it in agriculture. This is something that we don't see often in other areas and also arid areas in the globe. We wanted to see that we actually treat 100% of our wastewater and utilize it fully in food production, because that is the most sustainable thing to do here. We don't want to throw it into the seas or into the natural water bodies. And we need to, again, think of innovative solution in that regard. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to bring Maya in at this point on a similar question. Do you think that we will be able to emerge from these crises becoming better at solving environmental problems, or is there a danger that we will go backwards? Thank you, Maya.
Thank you for this very interesting question, as this question comes to minds of all of us, because living in this generally challenging era of turbulences, now we are facing additional problems related to this abnormal situation, which affects not only lives but also affects security and food security and environmental security as well. So I hope that it won't make us to turn back. And first of all, I want to hope that it will end soon. But in any case, it will have as a short-term and as a mid-term effect to the general economic situation in the whole world. And now we are facing the initial effects, and we can all see how it already affected the prices to the gas and oil, and in this kind of the supply chain. It will have the consequences. But as we are facing another challenge, I mean, the climate change, it is serious, it is obvious. I hope that the world won't change, and we will go on with the reforms, and we will go on with the obligations and and adaptation measures we have all agreed on. And once again, I hope that the war will end soon, but by no means we will face additional challenges and additional problems emerged after this world war. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Maya. Thank you for that. That's very helpful. I'm going to ask now, I'm going to move on to Tommy next. We've got some questions from our panelists, and I wonder if, Tommy, you could tell me, have you seen any whistleblowers in promoting environmental democracy? Any examples of how whistleblowing has been used in combating corruption and illegal financial flows? That would be very useful to know of your experience on that. And also, you talked a bit about the democratic deficit in some parts of Africa. We have a question on how we need to rethink international development in light of this disparity in terms of democracy. Do you have any thoughts on how that might be rethought? I'll turn over to you, Tommy.
All right, thank you, Fiona. To go to the question of whistleblowers, I can't say so much about whistleblowers promoting environmental democracy. What I'm fully aware of are whistleblowers that are being used by the various anti-corruption commissions established in these countries where we operate. To combat corruption. And so the Anti-Corruption Commission is offering 10% of the spoils if you successfully whistleblow on any entity or institution or governmental agency or senior person that has plundered state resources or resources placed at the disposal, and that applies also to civil society organizations. And so that's going on. Now, to the subject of environmental democracy, the challenge is that, you know, in places like Sierra Leone, where I've worked, between Sierra Leone and Liberia, where I've worked for a good part of the last couple of decades, it is very difficult to even know what you're going to whistleblow about, because ours is primarily an extractive industry. Logging, mining, plantation establishments, there's a few of them and growing in number. But generally the conversations and discussions between the investors or the investing companies and the governments, they're usually held away from everyone else. When environmental and social impact assessments have been done and there is public disclosures, it's very difficult to say whether public participation has in any way contributed to ensuring that these investors will abide by what they say in these in terms of environmental remediation. What's the result of that? Is that we have lost most of our forests. There is serious land degradation occurring as I'm talking to you. And the biggest fear now, as we begin to experience the impacts of climate change, is that for a predominantly agrarian based economy, our soil quality is on the decline. There is so much erosion, soil erosion, because of clearing of land to the extent that savannas are growing. So I don't know of any case where anyone has gone and reported on somebody who is doing something illegal, whether it's land grabbing or clearing an area of forest, because the ones who are supposed to be the custodians are very often known to be involved. And so it's one of those gray areas that I think perhaps these kinds of discussions can lead to some solutions. The last point I'd like to make here is, I'm aware in the years when we were monitoring sanctions on Liberia, noting the contributions that illegal logging and legal logging had contributed to the problems that led to the ongoing war at the time. We recommended the creation of an environmental crimes unit, which would oversee all matters pertaining to disregard for the environmental norms. Whether or not those recommendations were implemented remains to be seen. I think what has happened is that the environmental protection agencies that exist in the various countries are charged with the responsibility of ensuring compliance with laws and policies pertaining to environmental management. Unfortunately, these are high-level entities that deal directly with the enterprises, and there is very little scope for civil society to get involved in a peaceful way unless you launch a serious advocacy campaign that very often has resulted in people being brutalized or sometimes taken to court, and a whole range of, so people are really worried about even blowing any whistles about anyone. Over.
Thank you very much. That's a very important and sobering reflection there. Thank you very much for that, Tommy.
Well, for the second point about the democratic deficits and what possibilities exist, I think the various speakers have touched on perhaps the fact that in the current context of developing economies, maintaining democratic principles is a real serious uphill struggle with many slides and bumps up the hill. Therefore, moving forward, if anything must be done that would make a big difference, it will have to be about how you empower civil society or just the general population with the skills and the training and perhaps resources for them to tackle head-on the challenges that environment face. One quick example, let's say in a country like Sierra Leone, which was once 80% forested, now we have less than 10% of that, and we are losing all of it. We have a growing population. Right now, there are 2 million kids in school. If the government or any entities came together and invested a small amount of money using the power that they have to promote a campaign, let's say, for example, a national project, let's say, every child plants and cares for one tree, wherever you are. That will set the stage for the future generations to start learning about how to care for a resource that past generations have failed miserably on, but also get them to appreciate and understand that the future we're all fighting for is for their benefit, and that they can be the leaders that we support with the experience, with the knowledge, and also with the resources that we have. To me, that's the path to forcing government and public office holders to reckon with the fact that they haven't really done much with their leadership. And now the people have to show leadership so that these leaders can support them. Over.
Thank you very much indeed, Tommy. And from a moderator's point of view, that was a brilliant answer, because you've also managed to answer another question, which was about environmental and climate change literacy. We had a questioner asking if that is important in citizenship education. And I think you've just tackled that very well as well. So thank you very much, Tommy. I'm going to ask some quick fire questions to the rest of our panelists now, because we're running out of time, and I know that Lisa in particular has to leave very shortly. So I'm going to ask her very quickly. First of all, Lisa, can you give us any examples of success or failure when this environmental democracy approach has worked? Very quickly before you go.
Okay, so for example, the consensus on phasing out coal in Germany, it was success of the climate movement, because they brought the topic in the government, in the parliament, long before those people wanted to talk about it. And failure is, for example, in Bavaria, we have hindering legislation about windmills. And also there was civil society, there was protest for wind energy, but the protests against was they were louder and kind of better organized, more closer to the conservative government. So we're still fighting against that. But really, I think democracy is the key to everything in the climate aspect. So thank you for that I could take part in it.
Thank you very much. Yes, democracy is the key to everything. That's a very good message to end with there from you, Lisa. Thank you. I'm going to put the same question now to Marta. Marta, can you just give us any specific examples of environmental democracy working, or indeed be brave? If you can give an example of failure, that's good too. Thank you.
I would give you an example and also answer a question related to education or sustainable development. One of the things we have done was to develop a green pack for school children. And it's not a separate subject, it was integrated into the curriculum by teachers, by citizens, by NGOs. And now it's adopted to 20 languages, more than 5 million students. And in the areas that I pointed out, the most positive outcome was that in 3 countries, it was used for the educational reform. So in Serbia, Montenegro, and Kosovo, not only the Green Pact was integrated into every school, so every school children from the age of 6 is being part of it, but it also helped to actually revitalize the educational system. So I think that this is a very positive outcome because those actually achievements could be used for the future. And for me, the most important element is the education for the future generation. Without them, without the right knowledge, we will not be able to talk about what we have been talking about, environmental democracy. Talking about failures, it's always a challenge to work with governments and senior business people when it comes down to climate change. So unless there is also a so-called, I'm not calling it training, I'm saying sensitizing group of discussions, and especially involving more people from different countries, things will not happen. Because those are the decision makers in the parliaments, in the businesses that can make the difference. So for me, these are the 2 good examples. And if you don't succeed with involving the businesses and the high-level governmental people, that could be a failure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very, very good point there. And I'm going to give our last word of this session to Maya. If you could just give us your last message here. What do you think works? What do you think doesn't work? And what's the message you would leave people with? Thank you. I'm afraid we've lost you already there. Okay, well, we'll have to do without that last word, but never mind. Thank you very much to all of our brilliant panelists there. That was a fantastic discussion. We really touched on an awful lot there on how the world has changed, on what we need to do to get back on track to tackle our environmental crises, and on really how democracy has to be at the core of this. You know, parliamentary democracies are incredibly important in shaping public opinion and public action, but civil society around the world is also key, we've heard, and civil society can play an enormous role in helping to promote democratic solutions, even in countries where there is a democratic deficit. So those messages came out very clearly from that session. There are more sessions coming up. Let me alert you to the session on environmental democracy and international agreements, which is going to start shortly in about 12 minutes. So have a look out for that, and please do join in that. Don't forget to tweet any comments that you have, or indeed any questions. The hashtag is #OurPlanetNeedsDemocracy. So if you'd like to tweet about that, please do. So thank you to all of our panelists and speakers. Thank you to WFD. Thank you to all of our audience, and please enjoy the rest of the day as well. Thank you.